Tricking Jason's Chain!
So this past week, I've been trying to figure out what to talk about in this edition of JJC, and was having a little bit of a hard time. Then this morning, I read online about FEMA actually running out of money thanks to the tornadoes earlier this summer and now Hurricane Irene. FEMA's running low, which in and of itself isn't really a big deal. We're coming up to the end of the fiscal year and everything in Washington is hitting the end of their yearly budgets. But what struck me reading this was that FEMA is actually freezing aid and pulling money from tornado and flood-ravaged Missouri in order to give it to the East Coast. I guess if this shocks you, I have to ask why. Why would anybody be surprised that FEMA, a horrendous example of top-down federal bureaucracy, would pull aid from Joe to give to John? That's the way big governments work. But I'm obviously not a FEMA fan. In all reality, they're nothing more than a government insurance agency, to a point. The problem is FEMA is normally too removed from the people that need the money to know what's going on. So they come up with arbitrary rules and systems that pretty much end up broken. Take Katrina, for example. As soon as FEMA came in, the people of Katrina were SOL if they tried fixing or fighting the floods themselves. In fact, it was FEMA that drove away dealers from out of state trying to sell generators to the people that needed them. Why? It didn't go through FEMA and wasn't approved by, well, you guessed it, FEMA. That's the reason. I saw this firsthand when I worked for the state of Michigan during Hurricane Katrina. To help send aid, I assisted police officers, firefighters, and other personnel to get water pumps, excavators, and food down to New Orleans. And they never made it. During the drive down, FEMA refused to authorize the personnel and equipment. This is free stuff. Free pumps, free gas, free food, free help. And the people on the front line wanted it. They needed it. So why not FEMA? Well, it beats the hell out of me, but they didn't. So who ended up winning out? Thankfully, it was a small town on the Mississippi River that didn't receive the so-called FEMA assistance. And they were in pretty rough shape themselves. Now, I wasn't with them at the time, but I was told the reason this town in Mississippi got the help from us was because a couple of the officers stopped off after being told to turn around by the powers that be. They just happened to stop off at a hole-in-the-wall bar for dinner and talk to the locals. Hey, lucky for them. I also know somebody that now owns a very nice, very expensive cigarette boat, thanks to FEMA. He owns a recycling business and went down to contract the cleanup of New Orleans. But FEMA refused to contract to any businesses that were not local. So who was? Well, in this case, some 19-year-old that had a tree trimming business. That qualified him. So FEMA gave him millions of dollars to clean things up. In turn, he contracted to people out of state, like a friend of mine. But being 19 and not so good with business yet, he ended up blowing the money elsewhere, like a cigarette boat, and couldn't pay his contracts. So my buddy got paid by boat. It's a little bit hard to eat. You tend to chip your teeth on it. I think he would have much rathered the money. I bring up these examples because they display the inefficiency and poor management you get from top-down governing. So in the most recent case of Irene, FEMA cut the funding needed to Joplin, Missouri, so that it can go to places hit by Irene. Logically, this sort of makes sense in a demented sort of way. Except that money was promised to Joplin, and the people there made plans to fix up their city based on that money. So taking it away is actually worse than not giving it to them in the first place. At least they would have known where they stood. And how would you feel if you found out your mommy took your money away and gave it to drunk Uncle Ted? Think about it. Representative Ron Paul said he thinks it would be better without FEMA, and like it was in 1906. In many ways, he's right. It's not so much the fact that FEMA gives away our tax money, which they do in bunches, but there's strings attached to that money. I equate it to taking a loan from the mafia. Taking FEMA money means that you become a marionette to the federal government and all the overspending and inefficiencies that come with it. But you took the money, so you can't really say anything. At least in 1906, people had to fix things themselves without relying on the federal government and the bureaucracy that comes with it. So they prioritized. The locals knew what needed to be fixed first, much more so than Washington. So I say, cut the money, cut the cord, and let people decide what needs to be done. You might actually be shocked what the American people can do when Washington stops micromanaging. You can agree with me or not, it's up to you. But if you don't, it's probably because you're a leftist commie pinko living off the government's dole to pay for your Birkenstocks and medical marijuana.